So 4.5 years ago, I finally got diagnosed with hypothyroidism. I was put on medication. I was put on desiccated thyroid, and instantaneously, I felt so much better. I suddenly lost weight effortlessly for the first time in my life. I was able to eat more without gaining weight. All these little symptoms went away. My energy came back. I was able to work out. My hair came in. Like, it was truly amazing. And I felt this great for months. And I remember my sister saying to me during this time when I was telling her how great I was feeling, and she said, Karen, your body did that for a reason. Are you sure you should be on medication? And I was like, don't even say that. I feel better than ever. I'm going to choose to ignore what you just said. Now, I really wish I would have listened to her, because 6 months into it, I suddenly crashed. I couldn't get off my couch. I was the most depressed I'd ever been in my life. My skin was itchy. My hormones went crazy. I felt so terrible, the worst hypothyroid I'd ever felt. And I gained 10 pounds in a month, and it was the heaviest I'd ever been. So that was crushing. As a nutritionist and a weight loss coach, that was extremely hard for me. I realized that my reverse T3 had gone up even higher than it already was. Knowing what I know now and looking back onto that time, I know that I was doing everything wrong, and that the person that was treating me wasn't getting to the root cause. I remember him saying actually to me when I said, why do you think I have hypothyroidism? Oh, it's probably just familial. It's probably just being passed down from some family member. And I knew that my granny had hypothyroidism. So I thought, oh, yeah, sure, I'll take that. That's probably why. And this is, it's just a genetic thing. And I'll be on medication for the rest of my life. Now I know that what I had was something called cellular hypothyroidism. And I know this because of my guest today. Listening to him on another podcast, I was like, wow, I don't know if I'd ever come across somebody. And I've interviewed a ton of thyroid specialists. I don't know if I've ever come across somebody that was as knowledgeable as him about the root causes of hypothyroidism and really understanding how it works. Dr. Eric Belkavage is a chiropractic physician who has been in private practice in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania since 1996. He received his bachelor's degree in 1990 from Kutztown University and his doctorate degree in 1995 from Palmer College of Chiropractic. Eric is a certified nutrition specialist, a certified functional medicine practitioner, and board certified in integrative medicine, along with being a licensed chiropractor in Pennsylvania. Rejuvigen is a center that offers a blend of functional medicine and regenerative medicine combined with functional neurology and nutrition. Countless patients can now see relief from symptoms of conditions such as chronic pain, peripheral neuropathy, fibromyalgia, of course, thyroid problems, vertigo, diabetes, GI tract disorders, migraines, and weight challenges. So I am super happy to have you here, Eric. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. Oh, I've got a million questions for you, of course. So like I said, you just understand thyroid better than most people do. So how is it that you know so much? I'd like to hear that.
Well, I don't know that I know anything, to be honest with you, right? There's things it's things
Eric,
that
you know a lot.
Things I believe, right? So I think one of the things that we all have to take into consideration is that we're working with the best information we have, right? And so science is constantly changing, so we're always learning stuff. But I think I look at thyroid physiology a little bit differently definitely than the allopathic profession. And I think I look at thyroid physiology even a little different than we typically do in functional medicine.
Yeah, I think you do. Just
because of experience. I mean, I've been doing this 20 some years now, 27 years, I guess. And, when I started, I was taught by some of the best at the time. Datis Kharrazian was a great functional medicine practitioner and really gave the kind of the beginning foundation for my functional medicine training. I mean, my background before I went off to chiropractic school was medical technology. So I really thought I was going to go to medical school, but I got helped by a chiropractor and that changed everything. But I wound up getting into really functional medicine because of a family member getting diagnosed with fibroids, hypothyroidism, and iron deficiency. So my brother was like, hey, you need to, here's what my wife has, and I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do about it? I'm a chiropractor. I just adjust people. And he's like, well, you're going to figure it out, right?
Oh.
So it's your big brother, so you start trying to figure out what's going on. And that led me back into my blood chemistry, and that got me into this thing called functional medicine, which I really hadn't heard about. And then I started learning about thyroid physiology, and I was like, okay, this is different. These guys are saying it just happens. That's what I learned in my training, in the hospital and everything else, was thyroids go bad. That's just what happens. And then you learn in functional medicine, and now we're looking about immune issues and inflammatory issues, and talked about gluten and some of this other stuff. And I was like, oh, all right. And we're talking about, some of the protocols that Datis talked about. And I was like, okay, this is it. And started helping people. And then that made sense. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, but this doesn't really work. Because, you do a lot of this stuff and that we were learning about, and we're talking about conversion, reverse T3, and some of the stuff worked, but we're talking about, hey, here's a thyroid protocol. This is what you give them. These are selenium and all these other cofactors that help with the conversion. But in a lot of people, that didn't help. And then I started looking at the physiology of like, why is this not working the way it's supposed to? And we start talking, we're talking about the primary drivers, immune and autoimmune conditions, and the immune system's out of control, which is kind of what we learned. And I was like, why would the immune system be out of control? It just didn't make sense to me. We were still helping people, but I knew there was something we were missing, because we're trying to manipulate values. Like I was just in the same camp, like, hey, give T4 and T3, right? Because obviously the body's not converting, so you got to give T3. Obviously medical doctors don't know what they're doing because they don't realize that. And I was taught that reverse CT is blocking these receptors. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true either. And so I was kind of struggling. In the early part, I thought I was super smart because I didn't know much. Right. And so when I didn't know much, I thought I knew everything.
Yeah.
And all I had to do is a couple protocols, do adrenal protocol, gut protocol, and thyroid protocol, and I'm good. Right. Yep. Everybody will get better. And some of the healthy sick people got better, and a lot of the sick people did not get better. And it didn't matter if you gave them T4 or T3, they still had a honeymoon period, and then they didn't feel better. And it was like, dang, something's missing here. And it was a friend of mine, Ben Lynch, who's a pretty well-known guy. He's a he's a naturopathic physician, and he owns this company called Seeking Health. And he was talking about MTHFR and a number of other things. And he and I started talking because I was digging deeper and deeper into why some of these people just didn't get better. And I thought it was a genetic issue. So I got deep into genetics, and Ben was just really into teaching genetics. And so we hit it off. And I think we were prepping for one of the Seeking Health educational seminars, one of the first or the second one, probably is the second one. And he sent me a paper called The Cell Danger Response by Dr. Robert Navio. And I read that paper, and it's heavy. So for anybody who wants to read it,
I want to read it.
Go read it. Look at the pictures first, because that'll help you out in the beginning, because it's a couple. I read this paper every year, because every year I gain something new from it and a different understanding. But essentially what the cell danger response talks about is, Navio in this paper is talking about when a cell is in a low stress mode, it operates one way, and when it's in a stressed mode, it operates a different way. All right. And he talks about the different things that a cell does when it senses danger. It stiffens the cell membrane, reduces transport of glucose, it downregulates its metabolism, it decreases the production of peptides and proteins, and reduces hormone production, and it increases inflammatory mechanisms. I'm like, well, maybe what we see in this hypothyroid state isn't really broken physiology at all. Maybe what we're seeing is adaptive physiology. Maybe what we see many times that we think is broken isn't broken, right? And maybe we're trying to force all this thyroid hormone into people that maybe don't need it or shouldn't have it, because we're trying to, because they have the signs and symptoms and we're trying to fix it by just putting more in, but maybe we need to step back and ask, and take a look and say, is this an adaptive response to a threat, or is it a dysfunction? And I think that's where I was really struggling. And I even reached out to Dr. Nabio and said, hey, you talk about all of these systems. There's no mention of thyroid physiology in this paper, right? Like, what's the role of thyroid physiology? And he's like, you know what? I don't know much about thyroid physiology. And I'm like, how can you not know much about thyroid physiology? But I get it, right? He's taking this cell danger response, which is all talked about different ways, and he's kind of bringing it all together in one paper. But that piece was missing. But I knew that was the piece that we were missing from a thyroid physiology perspective. We're trying to fix the physiology of somebody from when it comes to thyroid hormone. Like, we're going to put more in, it's going to work. And reading that paper, I'm like, well, it's maybe we have to stop looking at this. The body's not broken. It's adapting to excessive stress, and maybe putting more thyroid hormone into the system gives us temporary change in symptoms. Maybe it changes lab values, but maybe the reason people don't do well on it, and we have a lot of people who don't feel well and have to increase their dose, decrease their dose, change the type of medications, is because we're trying to manipulate the physiology with thyroid hormone to be in homeostasis or normal, when their physiology is really in danger mode. So maybe it's the worst thing we can do. And so when I read that paper, that really changed my whole thinking about it. Instead of what do I do to convert, like, to kind of make it work, I started saying, I don't need to be addressing the thyroid gland itself. I don't necessarily need to try and try and put more T4 or more T3 in. What I really need to be considering is, why would the cells of the body downregulate themselves? Why would the body adaptively downregulate the thyroid gland? Maybe shut it down on purpose. And maybe that's really where we need to put our time and attention. And in functional medicine, we talk about root cause all the time. And even in thyroid physiology problems, we talk about it's an autoimmune condition. We got to reduce what's causing autoimmune. Maybe instead of telling people they have an immune system that's out of control and it's eating away their thyroid gland, maybe we need to take a step back and say, maybe that thyroiditis, maybe that immune-driven response is an adaptive response to an excessive stress response, and the global reduction of metabolism by shutting down the thyroid gland is an adaptive response. So it just changed the whole way I started looking at things. So I now look at everything through the lens of this cell danger response and ask that question, is this broken or adaptive physiology? Now, if you have adaptive physiology for an extended period of time, it can break, but many times we're catching people in an adaptive physiology, and the treatments we do maybe provide a short-term benefit, but I think they create potentially a long-term negative outcome. And when I read a paper, 2019 paper on cancer and thyroid treatment, that's when I was really convinced that we really have to change the way we look at thyroid physiology and the way we treat it. Because I always thought, well, if this is a danger response and we put more T4 into a system, and T4, if it doesn't get into the cell, can bind to receptors on the outside of the cell and cause cells to replicate.
Right.
Isn't that
yes.
what we,
Yeah. I was going to ask you that.
Isn't that what we call cancer?
Yeah.
And so this 2019 paper showed that the incidence of almost every type of cancer in people who are on thyroid medication is worse. So I was like, well, it's funny because a year or two before that, I told my co-author of the thyroid debacle, this is the study somebody needs to do, but nobody is going to do that study. And in 2019, I found that paper. I was like, no freaking way. Somebody did it.
Someone did it.
It did not get much attention, but that opened my eyes and I said, okay, we've got to change what we're doing here, because we may be creating more problems. So I know this got really kind of off topic a little bit from what you asked.
No, that's perfect. Because I was going to say something about that, not about cancer, but I was thinking in my head, and this is what I thought about my own system, was your body goes into this preservation mode, right? It slows your metabolism down, whether it's because you're not converting T4 to T3 or you're attacking your thyroid, your reverse T3 is going up. There's a reason why the body is doing that. So if you go speed up your metabolism by giving it the thyroid hormones, what is happening behind the scenes that you don't understand that's affecting in a negative way, because your body was preserving for a reason?
Yeah. And I think we think about the thyroid hormone. The only thing that thyroid hormone does is it gets converted into T3 and binds to receptors, that there's no negative impact of taking thyroid hormone. Like you can't really create a problem. Yet we see that hyperthyroidism can be a real issue, right? And what's really not talked about is thyroid hormone, especially T4, more T4 than T3, can bind to receptors, not necessarily inside the cells, which is T3 binds to primarily the receptors inside the cells and triggers what we typically feel as normal metabolic effects, right? That make us feel like we have good digestion and good weight loss, and we stabilize our weight, and we have good hormones and everything. But T4 can bind to those receptors on the outside of the cell and potentially create some problems. So we need some T4 to bind to the outside of cells because of what it does, but we don't want massive amounts of thyroid hormone in the system. And so I don't think any of us learned too much about thyroid physiology in our training. We learned about thyroid hormones made by the thyroid gland. It gets converted to T4, T3. What most of us learned, that most of that conversion is converted, of the T4 to T3 conversion is converted by the liver and the gut. That's where most of it occurs. That is not the case. It sounded good, right? But that's not true. And that T3 and T4, they really only, get into the cell and do good things. But we didn't learn about, hey, the cell gets to decide what happens. This isn't about diffusion. Like we just put enough in the bloodstream and it automatically gets into the cell and does what we want it to do. Thyroid gland makes thyroid hormone, and now we have a reserve of thyroid hormone T4 in circulation. And then the peripheral cells convert most of the T4 to T3 inside the cell based on their need and demand. So if I'm a cell and I want to slow down my metabolism, I don't convert T4 to T3 at higher levels, and I have a lower T3 state. And if I do want higher metabolism, I bring more T4 and T3 into cell, convert more T4 to T3, and have a higher T3 state. But every cell can regulate itself differently from the other tissues in the body. So my liver can regulate metabolism one way, heart doing another way, GI tract another way, all different levels of metabolism at different times. And so it's not all on or all off. So it's not just about what the gland makes. What's really more important about thyroid physiology is what's happening in the individual cells and tissues. And that part we didn't learn in school and training. And it's not taken into consideration for the most part in allopathic medicine, and to some degree in functional medicine, it's not considered.
No. And so give some examples then of what you mean when you say cellular danger. Like what's causing the danger that you're seeing typically? Like what are the top things?
Yeah, so cells are like people, right? So they want to be primarily, if life is good, we're in manufacturing mode, right? We're buying stuff, we're making stuff, life is good, right? Or if somebody's threatening me, then I'm not going to work. I'm not going to the store and buying stuff. I'm going to stay and I'm going to defend myself and my family, right? So cells are the same way. Their primary goal is to bring nutrients in, make energy, make hormones, make proteins, make neurotransmitters, make things so that we can be functional. That's what they want to do. And we have an immune system that's supposed to kind of keep the threats at bay, right? But if we get an organism, a toxin inside the cell, that may cause the cell to sense danger, okay? Let's say we get a bacteria or a virus inside the cell. That bacteria or virus, what's it going to use for energy? It's going to steal the energy from within the cell so it can grow, develop, replicate. And so as that organism steals energy from the cell's got sensors Mitochondria is a big sensor of that, that it says, whoa, we have a drop in energy in here, something's stealing energy, shut the doors and windows, lock everything down, let's figure it out, right? Just like if I went to the grocery store and I came in and I put all the stuff in the kitchen in the cupboards and I go to bed at night, tomorrow morning I get up and all the food's gone, something's up, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to be like, okay, what went on? Were the doors locked last night? Did somebody break in here? What's going on? Did you guys have a party last night? Like, I'm going to start asking questions. So when the cell senses this drop in energy, it wants to do the same thing. It says, hey, there must be a threat here. Let's stiffen the cell membranes. Let's slow down the general metabolism, and let's ramp up cell defense. And thyroid hormone plays a huge role in every aspect of that cell danger response. That cell danger response can be triggered by a bacteria, it can be triggered by a virus, it can be triggered by a toxin, it could be triggered by hypoxia or low oxygen, it can be triggered by emotional stress, it could be triggered by inflammatory signals or warning signals from other tissues because of an infection or inflammatory process or disease process. So there's a lot of chemicals that are constantly kind of floating around in the cells and tissues in the bloodstream that can either trigger good things or they can trigger, hey, danger, right? Somebody's breaking into my house, I'm locking the doors and windows, and I'm getting on the phone and I'm calling everybody in the neighborhood, yo, there's hoodlums in the neighborhood trying to break in, because I want to warn everybody else. Cells would do the same thing. They want to surround, stiffen the cell membranes, lock the doors and windows, and then start releasing a bunch of chemicals to tell everybody else that, hey, there's a problem going on, okay? So this is what happens to us as we go through time in life. And sometimes we're totally aware that this is going on, right? You get an acute infection, you get sick, right? You get tired, you get fatigued, you have no energy, you got diarrhea, you got constipation, you're exhausted, you're fatigued, right? No libido, right? Doesn't that sound like hypothyroidism?
Yep.
And maybe that's because it is, because you have an infection, the cells are in danger mode, and they're saying, hey, we need to slow the metabolism of the cell down. And the way the cell slows the metabolism of the cell down is it has less T3 in the cell, because when there's less T3 in the cell, there's less T3 to stimulate metabolism. So for your listeners, thyroid hormone, when we bring it into the cell, there's two forms of thyroid hormone, primary forms of thyroid hormone in circulation, T4, which is the primary thing that's made by your thyroid gland. It's a less active form of thyroid hormone. We call it a prohormone for the most part. And then once it gets to the cells and to the tissues, it can be converted into the active form, the primary active form, which is called T3. Inside the cell, that T3 is like a plug. It plugs into a receptor in your nucleus and your mitochondria, and it can turn on the machinery to make hormones, to make enzymes, to make proteins, to make the things that primarily make you feel good. It makes energy, so it can burn the fat off of your body that you're storing, right? That you don't like hanging around, that you call a muffin top. So it does manufacturing. T3 also binds to receptors inside cells that turn off processes. And that's the thing a lot of people don't realize, is that T3 is in the cell binding to some receptors, turning off certain mechanisms. And one of the mechanisms, or some of the mechanisms that get turned off by T3 binding, are the danger mechanisms. Like, why would the body do that? Well, if you're in manufacturing mode, you're in a low stress mode, do you need to generate a lot of inflammatory chemicals and proteins and things off into the system? Probably not, right? You're busy putting energy into manufacturing. We don't need security when we're in manufacturing mode. So if we're in low stress, we're in manufacturing mode. But as soon as I perceive danger, I want to decrease the T3 in the cell, so turn off that manufacturing process and ramp up the immune inflammatory process. And somebody might say, well, but why would you turn off the manufacturing process? Because if I bring more glucose into the cell, now I've got fuel for the organism, right? Fuel for the threat. If I bring more oxygen into the cell, I've got more food, more fuel, right? If I bring more iron in, I got more fuel for the organism, right? If I make amino acids into peptides or proteins, guess what? That organism can use those things, right? So the whole idea of the cell danger response is to stiffen the cell membranes, reduce the oxygen transport, upregulate the inflammatory processes, bring less fuel in so that I then instigate autophagy, which is a self-eating process to start cleaning up the cell itself so that maybe we'll find the thing that's hidden in there. And so this whole idea, this whole cell danger response, which is this innate adaptive response to stress by cells, thyroid hormone plays a key role in it. And so we look at hypothyroidism as the problem, but I think at a cellular level,
Not.
it typically doesn't start as a problem. It's an adaptive response to cell stress. Sure, if you have global glandular hypothyroidism, then you don't have enough thyroid hormone to run systems, and that can be problematic. But I don't think in most cases that the problem starts as a glandular issue. And the reason I say that is because if the issue was only the lack of production by the thyroid gland, then most people would just need to give them T4 and they'd feel fantastic. And maybe most people do, but that's not the people that come to see me. And that's what, and I don't think that's necessarily the case, I'm always seeing the rare person, because if you read the scientific literature, there is argument after argument. When do we start treating people? T4 doesn't work. T4 and T3. Do we give T3? Do we give T4? Do we give a combination? Doesn't seem to work. Why doesn't it work? Right. So there's so much, patients are unsatisfied. There's lots of literature and papers on that in the scientific literature. There's physicians who are frustrated with the model that's saying, hey, this isn't working. And so if it was just a matter that the gland can't make it and the rest of the physiology was homeostatic and working like there's no stress at the cell and tissue level, then you would just put it in, it would get to the cell, it would convert to T3, life would be good, all the symptoms would go away. And if you're one of those people that you started taking thyroid hormone medication and all the symptoms went away and you went back to normal, you haven't had to change your thyroid dose, everything's great, cholesterol's good, all the signs, all the symptoms are good, then that was probably the only thing that was wrong. But I just don't think that's the case for most people.
Me neither. So how many people do you come across where that works, where just giving T4 worked for that person? And I mean, obviously we're going to see the people that it doesn't work for, but I also catch a lot of hypothyroidism or sluggish thyroid where people haven't been diagnosed with anything yet. And then if they go and try and get on medication, it typically doesn't make them feel very good.
No, it actually makes them feel worse because it suppresses their TSH. So that's a conversation we can have.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to that piece. Like, yeah. I didn't get into this because I loved chemistry. I hated chemistry in school, right?
I hate it too.
The only reason I was a medical technologist in college is I transferred college. I got hurt at the one college I was at. I had to take a semester off to recover, transferred in the spring of the following year. And I was a business major and I couldn't get business classes. So I was like, well, what major does nobody take? And they're like, oh, medical technology. I'm like, great, that's my new major. And they're like, do you even know what it is? I'm like, no, I don't know, but I work in the hospital. Like, I was working part-time at the hospital so I could pay bills. And so I was like, I'll figure it out later. I'll just get me in and I'll transfer later. I'll change my major later. But once I got into it, I started kind of getting into it a little bit, and it became really, really interesting to me. Now I'm a geek. I mean, I read papers every day. But I think the really at the end of the day, we just don't put enough thought into what's really happening at that cellular level. And if we just keep doing this stuff and assuming that it's going to work, if we put enough in, and at some point we have to take a step back and say, man, this physiology, this body that came from 2 individual cells and produced all of this, one day in your 30s, it just woke up and stopped working. Your immune system one day just said, you know what? I don't even recognize that thyroid gland. I'm just going to destroy it, right? I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it.
No, No. And like in the functional world, they say, 99% of all hypothyroidism is autoimmune. I don't think so.
Well, okay, so here's the issue, right? So when we talk about autoimmune, we talk about the immune system damaging the gland, okay? And so that's an autoimmune condition. I would agree that a large percent of what's driving the thyroiditis of the gland is immune driven. Now, the question then becomes, is it a dysfunctional immune system, or is it an immune system that's responding to cues and adaptively change, right? And so I learned the same thing that, it's there's 8 or 9 theories of autoimmunity, right? Molecular mimicry and a bunch of these other things. And, we learned that, the reason that people who have thyroid issues can't eat gluten because gluten looks like
Thyroid.
looks like thyroid. So that's why it occurs. Maybe. But during my studies, and when I was really researching this, especially after reading the cell danger response paper, I started wondering, so when a cell is in danger, it releases things called DAMPs and PAMPs. So DAMP is danger or damage associated molecular peptides, proteins, or particles, and then pathogen associated molecular particles, proteins, or peptides. So what does that mean, right? So that means when a cell is in danger, it releases fragments of the tissue. And what's the benefit of that? Well, if I'm a liver cell, or liver, and my liver cells are being damaged, and I release pieces of the liver tissue out into the bloodstream, that can stimulate and activate the immune system to know what tissue's damaged and where to come for help. Okay. If a PAMP is a pathogen associated molecular protein, so if I'm a cell or a regular tissue cell or an immune cell, and there's an infection, and I take a piece of that organism and toss it out into the bloodstream, then that can bind to the immune cells, and the immune cells now know what they're looking for to go after. Okay. So the PAMPs and DAMPs are part of that danger response to say, hey, I'm the tissue that's being damaged, come help me. And oh, by the way, this is the thing that's getting me. So go find it and get rid of it, right? So I thought, well, I wonder if thyroid cells might have receptors for DAMPs and PAMPs, because my theory was, if a cell in danger needs to slow its metabolism down, and if we ask why would the cell want to do that, if you think about why, for the listener, when you have a high metabolism in your cell is making lots of exhaust, free radicals. Okay, so just the process of making cellular energy, T3 drives that cellular energy. You make free radicals, exhaust. You have antioxidants in your body that actually, in each cell, that kind of get rid of those free radicals, so we don't have a lot of what we call oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is an imbalance between the oxidants and the antioxidants. And typically, we want those really well balanced so we don't damage and destroy the cell. But if we have too much oxidants, not enough antioxidants, then we get oxidative stress, and that can damage the cell. So cells are pretty smart. We're going to make energy. It's going to be some exhaust. We're going to make antioxidants to get rid of it. Now, if I have a bacteria or virus inside the cell, what do I use to kill that thing? Free radicals. Okay, so so the body, part of the danger response is to make more free radicals to help kill the thing. So if I make a whole bunch of free radicals to kill the thing, and I've got this high exhaust output from making all this energy, now I've got all these oxidants. I don't make that much antioxidant. So now I've got a lot of oxidative stress in the cell, and now I damage and destroy the cell. We don't want that, right? You want your cells. So they need to make enough free radicals to kill the thing, but not kill itself. So how does the cell do that? Well, one of the things it does as part of that cell danger response is downregulate T3. So we have less T3 in the cell. So then I have slower mitochondrial function. When I have slower mitochondrial function, then I have less oxidative free radicals from just general exhaust. And now, instead of having to split my antioxidants like glutathione between the organism and the exhaust from the mitochondria, I can just manage what's there. Does that make sense? Did I explain that good enough?
So if somebody's taking thyroid medication when this is happening, does it fuel? So are we increasing the exhaust when we shouldn't be? So we're fueling the fires basically?
Yeah, unfortunately. So when you see so there's tests that you can run on the mitochondria. Okay.
Which ones?
So there's a test called a mitoswab. So it'll measure complex 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the mitochondria. And so you can see, and what I've seen with people who are taking thyroid medication, especially if they're taking more than they need, they'll have an upregulation of their mitochondrial density. So they'll be generating, because T4 binding to the integrin receptors on the outside of the cell are going to cause more mitochondrial mass. That sounds good, right? More mitochondria, it's a good thing. Except in a cell danger response, we're decreasing the mitochondria, we're slowing down the metabolism. We don't want more. In a cell danger response, we're actually getting rid of it. So if I increase my mitochondrial density and I'm decreasing T3 inside the cell, now I have all this mitochondrial density. I'm upregulating what we call complex 1 of the mitochondria. I'm producing massive loads of oxidative free radicals. Not good. Not good at all. Okay. So if you think about this, this is stuff in science, like, hey, the body does this on purpose, right? So that part, that makes sense, right? It's, like obviously it's a hypothesis, but there's a lot of science to say in a danger mechanism, this downregulation of the mitochondria, all these things happen. T3 plays a role in there. And one of the reasons is because we need to be able to not destroy all the cells by having all this oxidative stress. So it makes a ton of sense. But here's the thing. So what about the gland though? Because everybody, patients who have hypothyroidism are like, but I have a gland problem. I had hypothyroidism. I had a gland problem. Okay, well, think about this. The thyroid gland has thyroid cells, thyrocytes, right? They have some other different cells, but all the cells of the thyroid gland have receptors for these danger particles and these PAMPs. Why is that important? Well, if you think about it, cell danger, I'm going to slow down the metabolism on one cell, no big deal, I'll do it locally. Right? Makes sense. I'll just do it here. But everything else we still need lots of thyroid hormone. I'm only one cell. But now it's constant. And now I'm yelling to the other cells in the liver and saying, hey, I got a problem. You got a problem. There's more bacteria, viruses. And now lots of cells are getting downregulating and sending signals out. And maybe this starts to impact other tissues. And this is going on for weeks, months, or years. And so now we've got all these damage associated particles. We've got downregulation metabolism. We've got these PAMPs going out because we've got these chronic infections. And now these things are in circulation. Not only are they binding to the immune cells and stimulating reactions, but the thyroid cells have receptors for these things too. Why would a thyroid gland need a receptor for danger particles? It's not an immune cell. Well, what the science shows is that when these danger particles or these DAMPs bind to the thyroid cells turn into immune-like cells. They actually self-destruct, essentially breaking down and releasing signaling and inflammatory molecules out into the bloodstream. And what does that do? That attracts the lymphocytes into gland. And for those of you who don't know, when you have thyroiditis, that's the infiltration of immune cells into the thyroid gland. So is it the immune cells going to the thyroid gland because you ate gluten and the peptide structure is the same, or is the gluten triggering a danger response due to antibodies or reactivity? And this is happening day in, day out, and your immune system is getting all these danger particles. Those danger particles are binding to your thyroid cells. Your thyroid cells are then slowing down. if you had one cell or one tissue in danger mode for a short period of time, you downregulate the physiology locally. But if you have chronic inflammatory process going on, chronic danger responses going on, what's the most efficient way to turn down the metabolism of the body? Is it to turn it down in every individual cell while you're flooding the body with thyroid hormone? Or is it to shut down the gland itself, right? To turn off the source. So to me, it makes way more sense if I've got chronic danger signals, let me just turn off the source, right? The thyroid gland has receptors for these danger particles. We know by science that when those danger particles bind, the thyroid cells actually are the thing that release the chemicals that attract the lymphocytes. For a while, we taught everybody that the thyroid antibodies were like little Pac-Man eating away the thyroid gland. That's not true. The thyroglobulin antibodies don't create any damage to the thyroid gland, and the TPO antibodies, which got all the fame and all the attraction, like they were the big monsters eating it away. They do very little damage based on the most recent science. Wow. Very little damage. So it's not really the TPO eating away the gland. It's the immune cells coming in. What invited the immune cells in? The thyroid cells themselves. Why did the thyroid cells do that? Because they sense danger. Well, why would we need to downregulate the thyroid gland in danger? Because that's all part of what we do in danger mode. Slow down normal metabolism, ramp up cell defense. And is there any examples of this that we can see? Yeah, starvation is a great example of what happens to people in starvation. If you in starvation and famine, there's an upregulation of thyroiditis and reduction of thyroid function of the gland. You see higher levels of Hashimoto's in those cases. Is that broken physiology or adaptive physiology? Well, if you don't have enough food, do you want fast metabolism or slow metabolism, right? So, and I saw one study done in a country where they said, hey, we're just going to go in and give all these people thyroid medication. And they all got worse. Well, why did they get worse? Because they don't have any food. So you increase their metabolism and the thyroiditis got worse with treating it. Maybe they weren't broken at all. They were adapting to an environment where there just wasn't enough food. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it'll also upregulate reverse T3 because it's trying to store that energy because there's no food coming in. And we see this with the craze of intermittent fasting and fasting for long term. You test your thyroid before and after, you'll see your reverse T3 elevate when you're not eating. And it's dampening down your metabolism.
So almost any diet will create a change. And I'm going to do a series of posts on this because there's some discussion that maybe it's bad, time restricted eating is bad, and maybe that it's not a good thing.
Well, it's because it goes one way or the other. Like the world, all the thyroid coaches, and there's such a mix of reviews. There's some people that are like, oh no, go keto, go carnivore, it's going to help your Hashimoto's. And then we've got the people that are like the Ray Peat world, and it's like eat every couple of hours, eat high sugar foods. Like,
yeah, so neither one of those is right.
No.
Right? So it's somewhere in between, and we have to treat our individual client. But think about it. If you have a low T3 state and a low mitochondrial state, and you have a hypoxic state going on, what do you need to burn fat? You need an aerobic environment. So I've got chronic infection. Part of the cell danger response is to reduce oxygen transport into the cell. That's why we stiffen the cell membranes. So if I've got the cell danger response going on, I'm going to have tissues that are more hypoxic. My mitochondria is shut down. Am I going to be efficient at burning fat? I don't have the chemistry to really be ketogenic, right?
No.
So then you get people that are going, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, right? So you can't be full on ketogenic because you can't burn fat sufficiently. I mean, you just can't, right? So, but can you use time restricted eating? I think you can, but it's got to be done, and you got to be aware of what's going on. You got to manage things. There's another issue, and that is that the person who says, hey, okay, so that's bad. We're going to give you We're going to have you eat every 2 to 3 meals, every 2 to 3 hours. Well, wait a second. The person doesn't have thyroid hormone. They have a tissue hypothyroid state. They have lower thyroid hormone in some of these tissues. How do you expect they're going to get the glucose into the cell efficiently? To get glucose into a cell, you need thyroid hormone. You need transporters. And all of the transporters require optimal levels of T3. So why are most people insulin resistant? We tell people that they're insulin resistant because they eat too much glucose. Well, do they? I've got a lot of clients who are low carb and they're insulin resistant. Why are they insulin resistant? Because they don't have enough T3 in the cell. If they don't have enough T3 in the cell, what do you, I mean, they're already on 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. I mean, how many, what do you want to do? 2? Like, listen, it's
then
not
they'll go
about,
to carnivore because of that. Yeah.
But it's not because there's an issue there with the cell. The cell does not want the glucose because there's some type of threat, right?
Yeah.
So the interesting thing is all the glucose transporters don't work the same, right? So the glucose transporter that holds on the longest in a low T3 state is the GLUT2 transporter. What does that one do? Well, that's the one that pumps glucose out of the liver into the bloodstream and transport glucose into the fat cells. Does that sound like broken physiology, or does that sound like adaptive physiology, right? I'm in low thyroid state. I'm going to slow down the metabolism, but I can't burn fat. So I'm going to make sure that I can make glucose in the liver and shuttle it out, right? So that I have just a little bit of glucose out there to keep running these systems. Whoa, you gave me a whole bunch of glucose in that meal. Ooh, I can't do anything with it. I can't have it in the bloodstream that long. I'm going to jam it into this fat cell, right? And so we get fat when we have this stuff going on, and we tell people, hey, you got to exercise. You just have to exercise harder. You got to eat less. We got to stop that stuff and start saying, and it may be true for some people, but you got to listen to who your client is and say, okay, they're already low carb. They're already keto. They're already this. They're already exercising. That ain't it, right? And what we have to listen to what our patients are telling us. But in those states, I hear, there's a guy who wrote just talking about diabetes, just came, Jason Fung wrote a book, and I don't think he mentioned, I don't know for certain, but I don't think he mentioned the role of thyroid hormone physiology or the cell danger response plays in insulin resistance. It was more a book, I believe, about how much carbs you eat and exercise and those things. And I think that discussion is just worn out. And we think it's just about calories in, calories out, exercise, not exercise. Because there's people we all know that don't do a lick of exercise and eat crappy, and somehow they still have good metabolism, right?
So true. Yeah.
And, the person who does everything is struggling, and it's probably not because necessarily of how much they eat. It's probably more effect of, are they in cell stress or cell danger, or are they in a homeostatic state? Because if we think about it, how homeostasis and metabolism is supposed to work, the more food I eat and the more food I start to store, the more I should send signals to my brain to increase my metabolism, shut down, create satiety, shut down hunger, and burn more calories. That's how it works. And that's how it works when you're 10 and 15 and 20 and 30, when your metabolism works really good. Now we see kids today, unfortunately, due to their diets and their lifestyles and their, and antibiotics and how, all the stuff that happens, that they're obese at an early age. But that didn't happen before because we were super active. We didn't eat a bunch of that stuff. Our metabolism worked really good. And then we're in our 60s and 70s and we're getting inflamed. And then things are you're starting to see the slow down metabolism. But today we have a lot of cell stress really early in life. But I would argue that almost everybody, I think they talk about the amount of people that have thyroid physiology problems is about 9, not 10%, maybe around 10% of the population. I'd argue that it's probably closer to 50% have a level of tissue hypothyroidism, because to be insulin resistant is a level of tissue hypothyroidism. There's got to be some cell stress response going on.
Why
so
do you
I think it's much higher.
Eric, looking at it from the cell danger response lens, why then is it that women have more hypothyroidism than men?
Well, I think there's a potentially a number of factors, and I think one of those factors, definitely hormones play a role in that. I think there's a huge role there. I think there is, I hate to talk about genetics as a role, but I think there's a genetic factor that definitely plays a bit of a role. And this is going to sound, I don't want to sound mean, but I think women have a tendency to take on a lot more stress, and hormone regulation plays a huge role in that. And when we're talking about a cell danger response, it's a response to stress, and stress is physical, it's chemical, it's emotional, it's microbial.
Yeah.
And women, a lot of women have a tendency to put themselves last.
And our
so,
brains don't work the way men's do when it comes to stress. Like we deal with it a lot differently.
well, you
We're more
process it.
sensitive to it.
Yeah. I mean, you process your catecholamines about 30% slower than men if everything is working appropriately, because the estrogen load. So the same hormones that have to metabolize my catecholamines, that have to that work on metabolizing alcohol and other things, also have to metabolize estrogen. So if I have a lot of estrogen in the system, like something's got to give. So this is why when men and women get in an argument, like an hour later, the dude is forgotten about it. And the woman is maybe like, it's like 2 or 3 days later, she's still irritated about it. And it's just probably because she processes it a little bit slower. So I think there's a combination of factors. Women's physiology goes through a lot more ups and downs through life, between hormones that have to cycle on and off every month.
And then that cellular danger, I mean, it's within the cell. And like you said, all hormone receptors are in the cells. So it could go to that step of, is that cell danger response affecting these hormones that women have so much more ups and downs with? We have more of some than men do, like estrogen. So then that is affecting also the thyroid physiology.
Absolutely. I mean, I had this discussion with somebody last week. We were talking about infertility, and they're trying to fix it by, their physicians are trying to fix it by manipulating just sex hormones, right? I'll just get my hormones injection, getting that stuff. I'm like, listen, your infertility is a combination of 3 primary system problems. It is an inflammatory issue, an inflammatory and immune issue. It's a thyroid issue, and it's a sex hormone issue. And all of those are probably driven by excessive stress responses, right? And so we don't necessarily think about this, but what goes on in your uterus during the different phases of your cycle, up and down regulation of your immune system, up and down regulation of thyroid physiology in there, up and down regulation of hormone physiology. We just think about the estrogen and progesterone and what's going on, but your immune system is going up and down, activated, unactivated, and deactivated, because at certain parts of time, you don't want this little critter sperm going in there and getting in there. You want to get rid of it, right? There's only a certain period of time you want any critters in there. And so you all of this stuff ties together. So I just think overall, women's physiology is a bit more complicated and involved. And I think their physiology is more adaptive to that danger physiology. Like, whoa, we got to manage stuff a bit here. And I think part of it is because women produce something that men don't. And I know somebody might find that offensive, but I don't care, right? You produce babies, right? And so, hey, part of that danger mechanism, I think, is like, hey, we're not healthy here. Shut all the physiology down, right?
Can't get pregnant. Yeah.
Right. And I think when somebody says, I'm struggling to get pregnant, I need to get pregnant. Oh, well, maybe you're unhealthy. And that part of the issue is your body's adaptively saying, this is not the right time to do this. And maybe that has something to do with why when we have a tendency to force pregnancies or have a pregnancy, and maybe that system is overridden, maybe that's why we have kids that start to have more health challenges early on in life. I don't
Mhm,
know for
mhm.
certain, but we do know that people, especially when women have hypothyroidism, and especially I'm going to say tissue hypothyroidism, it definitely impacts the neurodevelopment of their child. And there's enough literature
Yeah. Oh
to
yeah.
justify that, right? So,
100%.
we've got all these kids having challenges today, and somebody would say, well, we just never diagnosed it before.
Mm-mm.
Listen, I don't remember this. I mean, maybe I was just a dumb kid, but we didn't have kids with as many challenges
No,
when I was growing up.
heck no.
It just wasn't there.
No, I agree completely. Yeah. So what is happening then when do you think it's like a protective thing that happens when the medication is coming in? So somebody's getting dosed with all this medication. At first, their cells are taking it in and using it as it should, and it feels great. And you feel great on your medication for that first month. And then the same story is always heard, which is, I don't feel anything. I went back to having my hypothyroid symptoms. Is this the body going, we can't have this T3. This is producing too much energy, and then something happening to make it so that we're not able to use it. Some people call it pooling, and I really disagree with that term.
Yep.
That it's the medication's pooling and it's not getting into the cell. I think that that's bull, and that it's going into the cell, but then something's happening within that cell to make it not work.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily buy all the pooling analogy and that kind of stuff. So most of the deactivation of thyroid hormone occurs at the plasma membrane. There's some discussion that the primary deactivating enzyme is called deiodinase 3. So when we have inflammatory mechanisms, that's a big driver in upregulation of deiodinase 3. Now, short term, it'll increase the conversion of deiodinase 2 as well, but D2 is upregulated, D3 is also upregulated. So now you have the net effect winds up being a low T3 state. But that deiodinase 3 is made in the endoplasmic reticulum, an area inside the cell, and then it's actually transported closer to the plasma membrane, and the deactivation occurs at the plasma membrane. And some papers say that maybe it's actually released out of the cell and the conversion occurs in the outside the cell, but it's not, the conversion's either happening right at the cell membrane and inside the cell. So that T3 isn't hanging out inside the cell. So T4 is getting deactivated at that plasma membrane. It's not really even getting much of a chance to get deep into the cell, and it's being shunted back out. And what I think some physicians don't realize when they see a high reverse T3 and they're like, well, I'll just give T3 because that T3 is blocking a function. Well, deiodinase 3, if it's in the cell and it's upregulated, it deactivates not just T4, it deactivates T3 as well. So it
won't convert it to reverse T3.
Deiodinase 3 does not convert it to reverse T3.
No. Yeah. Okay. So
there's a couple problems in functional medicine. One is, and it makes us not, when we say this stuff, I think this is when allopathic physicians are like, these people don't know what they're talking about. So when we say that reverse T3 blocks T3 receptors, there's no science that shows that. There is potentially some possibility, but I think the affinity for those receptors is like 200 or 1,000% less affinity for T3 receptors, nuclear T3 receptors than T3. So the chance, I think it's like 1,000%, something like that, 1,000-fold. It's not going to happen, right?
No,
it's not happening. And when we think about the cell, we're like, well, it's a small thing. So if it's happening at the plasma membrane, why can't it get into the mitochondria? It's like saying, like, I'm in Philly, right? And Pittsburgh's close. Well, it is close, but it's not cellular. You know what I mean? It's not really happening. So deiodinase 3 could translocate to the nucleus and deactivate deiodinase and deactivate T3 or T4 right in the nucleus. It could do that. There is some science that shows it, but there's no science that really shows that these reverse T3 blocks the receptor, even if there is some deactivation there. So the whole idea that reverse T3 has this blocking effect, it doesn't. And so when people say that, they don't understand the physiology. The other thing sometimes people say is, well, it binds to the receptor because it's a mirror image of it. It isn't a mirror image. You look at T3 and you look at reverse T3. They are not mirror images of them, of each other. So that you can just get rid of that analogy, like it's a mirror image of the cell, it binds to the receptor the same. So those things don't happen. If you want to say about anything that's blocking, it's deiodinase 3, right? It's the enzyme that's really blocking the action because it's deactivating it. Now, the thing about T3, I think that makes some people feel a little bit better, is that when you deactivate T4 to reverse T3, reverse T3 doesn't really have any impact that we know of right now inside the cell. It goes out of the cell. It does have the potential ability to bind to these integrin receptors on the plasma membrane, and that may be problematic because it can trigger cell replication. So maybe not such a good thing to have high reverse T3, but it's not happening inside the cell. It's not happening at the mitochondria. But T3, when it gets deactivated to T2, and there's a couple different forms of T2, some of the T2 can actually still support mitochondrial function. So I think that's where sometimes people get a benefit, because even when we're deactivating it, there can be some benefit there. And I think that's one of the things when we talk about where we need to have a little different conversation when we're talking about fasting and we're talking about hey, T3 goes down, reverse T3 goes up. Well, yeah, if I'm using fat as a fuel source, remember, I can get more energy out of a fat molecule than I can out of a glucose molecule, right?
Are you asking me?
I'm kinda, but right. So when we look about the calories that we get out of a fat molecule versus,
we get more calories out of a fat molecule than a glucose molecule. Yeah.
So if I'm more efficient at getting energy from a fat, right, from this,
but isn't it faster to get it from the glucose?
It's quicker.
Yeah.
Right. It's faster.
It's faster.
But it's more, I can get more. So if I can get more out of one molecule,
which is
do I need to drive this process as heavily?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would think that we would differentiate the glucose still.
So
even though you get more energy out of a smaller amount, right? Okay. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, I got it.
So we could be a bit more efficient. So maybe part of the issue is if I'm going to be burning a lot of fat, right? Think about this is if I'm burning sticks, like little sticks and kindling, I need a lot of it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I need a lot to keep that going. If I got a big old fat log, I can put that on there and it can burn longer. So I get more fuel longer, right? So if I need quick energy, I need glucose because I can do that anaerobically through glycolysis, right? I can just drive that process. There's a net negative, but I can make energy efficiently, quickly, I'm going to say. When we slow down the metabolism and we slow down that electron transport chain in a hypothyroid state, it's actually more efficient, but there's less disbursement of excess energy through heat and dissipating it that way. So we have, I won't get into the UCP molecules and those things, but I think part of the thing we see when people are fasting and they're using more fats and ketones as a fuel source is that they're more efficient with energy production. They don't need to run that mitochondria as pushing things through it as hot, because if I can generate more ATP, if I'm burning fats, than I can if I need a lot more glucose to do the same thing. I'm more efficient. I don't need to push it as hard. So I think there could be a benefit there. I don't forget how we got off the topic there, but I think when we're thinking about when we're talking about what's happening with the cells, I think the discussion about reverse T3, we got to let that one go. It's not doing what we think it's doing. I don't think that by providing T3, when you see reverse T3 and say, hey, I'm going to give you T3 because I'm going to get rid of the reverse T3 and now it can't block function, that's nonsense. But I think what happens when you get T3, you didn't have T3. Now all of a sudden you get T3 and you're like, whoa, that feels good. And then all of a sudden your body goes, yeah, but I don't want it.
Yeah.
Right. And so it takes a little bit. Right. So, and then
Yeah.
it's like, hey, I need more, because now the body's working harder to get rid of it. It's like, think about alcohol, right? In the beginning, just a little bit of alcohol made you feel good, and you did a little too much and you didn't feel so good at all. Right. And then you take, well, that was good, but now I got to drink 2 glasses of wine to get that same little feel good symptom. Right.
Yep.
Now 2 glasses doesn't work anymore. Now I'm slugging down a bottle, right? Because to get that same effect. And so I think it's kind of like the same thing. You get that honeymoon effect initially where it feels good, and then I can't get it anymore. And I think, from an addiction standpoint, it's kind of the same way, right? You're constantly chasing it. And I think that's what happens sometimes with the thyroid hormone.
I think so too.
The problem too is that we have to keep in mind that the brain physiology works differently than the peripheral physiology. The hypothalamus is 10-fold more sensitive to T4 than the peripheral tissues.
Oh, I didn't know
So
that.
I can quickly saturate the hypothalamus and drop TSH and still feel hypothyroid. So in a homeostatic state, the regulation may be that TSH may regulate, what's happening at the hypothalamus may be more closely regulated to what's going on in the periphery. But in that cell stress response, that danger physiology, the brain is kind of upregulated. The peripheral system winds up getting downregulated. So in that stress situation in the brain, there's D2 and D3, but D3 is actually turned off. D2 is only turned on. So now I get more T4 converting to T3 at the hypothalamus, TSH and TRH drop. Right? So you'd say, well, why would the body do that? Well, if I'm being chased by the proverbial tiger, what do I need? I need my brain and my muscle tissues to be like, come on, right? And I'm running. Do I need the peripheral conversion of thyroid hormone to regulate my sex hormones in that moment? I'm not stopping to have sex while I'm getting chased by the tiger, right?
No.
I'm not stopping for a happy meal, right?
No.
I'm not stopping to have, take a nap, right? None of that stuff's important. So brain gets upregulated early on and it drops TSH. The problem is, as TSH drops peripherally, TSH is a signaling molecule to convert T4 to T3. So as initially in the danger response, we're increasing T4 to T3 conversion in the hypothalamus, dropping TSH. So you start to feel hypothyroid. You go into the doctor and they're like, you're fine. Your TSH is normal. Matter of fact, it's actually low. You're more hyperthyroid than you're hypothyroid. You're just stressed out. You don't eat enough. You don't exercise, or you eat too much. You don't exercise. You're depressed, and you struggle for another couple months or years because this stress inflammatory mechanism is suppressing it. If they ran more than the TSH, they might see, I've got a low T4, I've got a low T3, right? I've got increased reverse T3, but they're not measuring it. And so then they're not seeing that tissue hypothyroidism until there's overt glandular hypothyroidism. So that's a big part of the problem. Yeah. So that's really important, because people, even when we're treating people and people are trying to drive TSH too low, they don't realize if you're starting to drive that TSH under 1, your T3 and free T3 are going to be low, because you're taking away one of the prime drivers of conversion. I don't want my patients, if their T3 or free T3 is low, I don't want their TSH under 2.
Yeah, because you want it to be working into pushing out that thyroid hormone.
Right. I did a Thyroid Thursday on Thursday, where I went through 2 years of one of my clients, and the endocrinologist is looking at a 2-something TSH and going, I got to put them on more medication. I'm like, you do not need to put them on more medication. Look at their thyroid values, and their thyroid values, their conversion was much better. Their symptoms were better. He puts them on a stronger dose of thyroid medication. TSH goes down. He's happy as all get out. It's under 1. Free T4 goes up to 1.7 or 1.8. But I ran the panel with the rest of the labs that he didn't see, and T3 and free T3 tanked, reverse T3 goes up, and the patient's symptomatic again. I'm like, you don't, I know what he's doing, but he's not looking at the chemistry.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is what happened with me. Like my labs looked absolutely fantastic. My numbers were exactly where they should be. If anything, I was a little leaning towards hyperthyroid when I was so ill because nobody was checking and watching my reverse T3 and seeing what I was doing with my conversion.
And the ratios become really important there, right? So if you look at the ratio, you can look at T3 to reverse T3, you can look at free T to reverse T3, and you could free T3 to free T4. If those ratios are all off, then you're just, if those hypothyroid symptoms you have are real.
Yes.
Right. And then you go, look, do I have inflammatory markers? I do. Oh, okay. Well, that's what drive it. Do I have any tissue indicators that I have tissue hypothyroidism going on, or cellular hypothyroidism, tissue hypothyroidism? I use those words interchangeably. Well, yeah, I got insulin resistance. Okay. How about lipids? Oh, yeah, my cholesterol's high, LDL's high. Okay. Right. Do you have problems with detoxification? Yeah. Look, I did my Dutch test. My methylation stinks. Well, okay. Right. So but if you don't ever run those, anything more than a TSH and a free T4, you're never going to see it. But allopathic medicine's job is, that's not what they're looking for. And I think part of the reason is when they were trying to, early on, when they were trying to look at the rest of the panel, T3, free T3 and reverse T3, and they were running those early on, I don't think they could figure out, because they didn't know how the cell physiology worked.
No, yeah, they didn't know what to do with it.
They didn't know what to do with it. So they just scrapped it all together and said, hey, we just won't look at them.
Yeah. What about when someone's like, those lab markers are all very important, and I think everybody should have those done to try and help figure it out. What if they all look normal, but there's still that high reverse T3? Like, what are you seeing in your practice with your labs? What other testing are you doing to help uncover the root cause of the cellular danger? Like, do you do heavy metal testing, GI map? What do you find?
I think foundationally, if I've got a person who's got, well, who I think has tissue hypothyroidism, and they have signs and symptoms of it, then even if they don't have tissue hypothyroidism, if they've got signs and symptoms, something's wrong, right? So I think foundationally for me, I look at a comprehensive blood chemistry panel as a start. And with that, everybody thinks they got a comprehensive blood chemistry panel because that's a loose term, right? So my panel is 65 tests and a urinalysis. Okay. So it's full thyroid panel, full iron panel, CBC, differential, full lipids, in fasting insulin, a bunch of inflammatory markers. So it's a pretty complex panel. That's a start point for me. So I want to look at that, and I've done a couple Thyroid Thursday videos on this. Like, this is how I look at it, right? I look at the thyroid panel, what's going on with the thyroid physiology. Is there problems there? All the values could be normal, but the ratios are off. So that's important to me. Then I'll look at inflammatory markers. Then I'll look at insulin markers. Then I'll look at, and I just kind of break it all down. Then I compare what I see there with their health history, their health timeline, their signs and symptoms. And then one of the places I'm almost always looking is the GI tract, because 70% of the immune system centers around the GI tract. Everything goes in through the GI tract. Everything comes out through the GI tract. So, and we know so much. So much that the gut physiology plays a role in every aspect of our physiology. We really don't know much about the gut. I almost said we know a lot about the gut. We know a bunch, but we don't know it all. We're still trying to figure all that stuff out. But there's a trillion organisms in there that play a massive role to our health, our physiology, and our immune system. And so I would say on the vast majority of people, I look at a functional GI test.
And you find a lot of problems with them?
I do. I mean, I do. So
I don't see a lot, so that's why I'm asking.
So there's a bunch of different tests out there. I think
I've seen a lot of the GI map, and for sure, H. pylori might be elevated and a couple of bacteria is off, but I rarely see somebody with some like really bad parasite or.
Well, I don't necessarily see anybody with some really bad parasites. So I used to run the GI map test a lot. I've switched to the Vibrant gut zoomer at this point. I think it's got more markers on it. So instead of one marker of inflammation, calprotectin, it's got 7 markers of inflammation. So we can get an idea. Do we have inflammation? It's got markers of biophysiology on it. It's got secretory IgA like the GI map does. It's just more in depth. The other thing it does is it really looks at a lot more of the commensal bacteria and giving an idea of high or low. And while I don't often see a lot of parasites, you see posts with people like blastocystis homicis is the thing that causes hypothyroidism. Listen, any organism, I don't care what it is, right? If you have any organisms, especially a latent infection in the body, and for the listener, organisms, you're loaded with organisms. Like the viruses, you didn't get rid of them. They're still there. They're probably in dormancy. And if bacteria and everything, like the organisms want to hang out, right? They're everywhere.
They say blasto is even like candida. There's some cultures out there, everybody's got it. So you can't mark it on that.
So it's about balance, right? So if you've got, there are some labs that'll do immune reactivity. Like if you have high antibodies to something, then it's probably an active infection, probably a latent infection that's hidden. But you have immune cells that are designed to be scouting these things out, looking for them. Sometimes they find them, sometimes they're hidden in there, latent. So a dormant infection is like Sleeping Beauty in the cell, sleeping, not bugging anybody, not creating any problems, not stealing any energy from the cell. That thing is dormant. Think herpes, the cold sore, right? Hanging out in the cell, not causing you any problems. You go out in the sun, you get emotionally stressed. Now you damage some tissue. All of a sudden, now you get this big honking thing burning on your lip, right? In about 7 to 10 days, your immune system gets it under control, hides up all the iron, gets rid of it so that the virus doesn't have anything to eat, and it goes back into dormancy. So that's a dormant infection. They can wake up and go away, wake up and go to sleep. So then you have latent infections, and these are infections that aren't replicating, but they're in the cell. They're still stealing energy from the cell, still triggering that cell stress or cell danger response, and your immune system can't seem to find it. I tell my patients like the Unabomber, right? So for the people that don't know the Unabomber, go to Netflix. I think there's a special on there, you can watch it. But the Unabomber was this guy living in like a 9x9 cabin in Montana somewhere, right? Nobody would have thought he was causing any problem because he's hidden from the world, but yet he's sending out these mail bombs, blowing people up, right? Latent infections are kind of the same way. They're in the cell, they're stealing nutrition and energy from the cell, releasing inflammatory chemicals out into the system, but the immune system's struggling to find it. And so the immune system gets chronically upregulated.
Do these have names like that you could throw out there? Like
almost any virus could be in there. Epstein-Barr could be
I was going to say Epstein-Barr, Lyme, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Co-infection. Yep. Some of the co-infections, Klebsiella. Like you think about just things are in there. So, but typically we have, you have immune cells that are supposed to do that. I mean, they're supposed to go out there. I mean, your natural killer cells, part of the reason what they're supposed to do is be like checking every cell out. Like, hey, is something going on in there, right? If there is, hey, let's engulf that thing and get rid of it. But there's like active infections, and that's the one most of us understand. Like, I got a fever, I got chills, and
COVID.
Yeah, I got COVID, right? And you're sick for like an intense sickness for a short period of time. The people with chronic health issues are the people that typically have latent infections. What's interesting is a lot of those people are like, I never get sick.
Yeah.
But they're chronically ill. Like everybody in my house gets sick. I don't. I'm healthy, but I'm chronically ill. Well, what's probably happened is your immune system stinks. So the immune cells are getting past those barriers. I mean, the organisms are getting past the immune barriers, getting into the cells and tissues without appropriate kind of, National Guard coming out to get rid of them. So I think it's probably better if you're the person who, hey, everybody got sick, I got sick too, and be able to deal with it relatively easily than being chronically ill and never getting sick. because when you look at a lot of those people that are never get sick but are chronically ill, they got lots of immune, autoimmune, and if you look at some of the latent infections, they got a lot of antibodies to different organisms going on because they have those latent infections. So, and it could be yeast, candida, it could be almost anything that's creating these chronic immune responses in them, but they're not having a typical like sick response.
Yeah. And what about, what's your experience with heavy metals being part of the issue?
So I think a lot of us are exposed to heavy metals, and I think the way I learned it, you know, we all have them. We're all
We all
exposed
have
to
them.
them,
Yeah.
right? We have a system in place to detoxify them. The chemicals aren't typically big enough to activate an immune response by themselves. And I think it's kind of to simplify it, like, hey, we got this toxin. All right, no problem. Send it to the liver. Let's get it out of here. Oh, liver's not working. Put it into storage. We'll deal with it later, right? And so people get loaded with these things in fat cells. But they typically don't trigger necessarily like autoimmune type responses. When they start to do that, I think they can still trigger immune. Hey, there's a lot of chemical there. It's toxic. It could block receptors and create problems. But when we talk about autoimmune issues, from what I've learned, is that what really drives the process is the toxin binds to a piece of tissue. The body knows the toxin, knows what to do with it, knows how to get rid of it if it's got all the systems in place. But and it knows the tissue and knows that, hey, that's me, I shouldn't go after it. But when you have a piece of toxin, like a heavy metal or something that's gets attached to a piece of tissue, that combination creates what we call a neoantigen. And now that's something the immune system goes like, that's new. I don't know what that is. And we got to go, now we're going to react to it. So the next time you're exposed to that toxin, that chemical, we drive antibody response. Now that antibody starts going after the toxin, but it also might go after whatever tissue that thing was attached to initially. And that may be which drives a lot of the tissue-based immune damage when we have heavy metal stuff. But I think I think we're all exposed to it. Why do some people have greater problems with it driving problems? I think it comes back down to the same thing with, especially with the cell stress and cell danger response. If you've got cell stress going on, what's your primary focus? Detoxification or inflammatory mechanisms? I think some of the detoxification pathways get down regulated. They get a lot of these things starting to build up in the system, and they start compromising physiology.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
So,
yeah.
But the tough part about heavy metals, and a lot of people have different opinions on this, but you got to be super careful when you start trying to liberate toxins.
Oh my gosh, yes.
From the body. And
I learned that the hard way.
Right. And you start liberating these things. And if you have compromised barriers, and it's not unusual that somebody has a compromised blood-brain barrier, especially if they have a leaky gut, now these things are crossing into tissue where they really, really should not be, and binding to tissue. And now you get autoimmune issues, immune-based autoimmune issues in brain. That's not good. And there's a physician named Stephen Jennis, who's Canadian, and he's probably one of the brighter minds in the detoxification pathways. And and you listen to him a couple of times, and I've sat down with a couple of times. I've heard him at a couple of conferences, and it makes you really have pause about trying to actively try and detoxify somebody and with heavy metals. And so my thought process is, yeah, I think heavy metals can become an issue. I do some antibody testing to see if people have reactivity to it. I think if you're going to do heavy metal detox, make sure many times there's medications that are needed to do some of that stuff, and different things based on what it is. And I'm not a medical physician, so that's not in my wheelhouse, but my goal with my clients is reduce the cell stress, improve the detoxification pathways and support them, and then do things to slowly work and liberate fat metabolism. And then we get slow dispersal of those things back out, and we got a healthy liver, and we have a healthy 2.5, and we have a healthy 3.0 for clearance. And I think that's probably the better way to get things out. versus for the vast majority of people. And, I made this mistake early on in practice and, going through say, oh, do this. And yeah, it did not necessarily go well. And so, Stephen he's a super soft-spoken, but super smart, intelligent man. And
You know what his website is?
I don't.
How do you spell his last name?
I think it's spelled just like genius, because I
Okay.
kept saying genius and he's like, it's genus.
Okay. Okay.
So
Well, that's good to know. I'll find it and put it in the show notes if I can find it for everybody.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Because I
I
would have been
think
like,
that's
if my
huge.
name's
Yeah.
Janice, I'd go with genius all the
Yeah.
time.
Hello. And so how often are you in your clinic then? And tell us, of course, where everybody can find you and how you're working with people. But are you like seeing really great results with this as far as, are you helping people to get off their medication and getting to that root cause? Like, how successful are you with that?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people come and their goal is, I want to be off thyroid medication. I'm like, listen, you may need thyroid medication, but you might be able to reduce the dose you need. Some people get off. So I've been doing this 27 years. Most of my clients have either had to reduce their dosage, and many people have had to get off of their medication because it's just too much. So the case I just did on my Thyroid Thursday the other day, I mean, this person's down from 150 micrograms when I met them 2 years ago, down to 50 micrograms and ready to probably go down again.
Yeah.
So, what's happening there? So this is a person who's had thyroiditis. I think we learned that thyroid glands, once it's damaged, it can't come back.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Yeah.
The thyroid gland turns over about every 8 years. So if the thyroid gland can turn over about every 8 years, then it can replace damaged cells with 6 cells. 6 cells with healthy cells if the threat and the damage is gone. So in my practice, by not trying to actively manipulate thyroid hormone, but looking at somebody and say, okay, what's creating excessive cell stress? What can I do to reduce or eliminate that through diet, lifestyle modification, and strategic supplemental protocols? If I can reduce or eliminate those stressors and then support the recovery from this kind of stress regulation to homeostatic regulation, then what I see over time is signs and symptoms improve. Thyroid medication dose has to go down, because as they start to absorb more and convert more, they need less. And we start to see the thyroid gland actually starting to produce more thyroid hormone. Now, we're not necessarily getting in there and measuring, is that what's going on there? But if a person needed 150 milligrams of T4 at one point, and now they only need 50, something happened, right?
Something's working better.
So something's either making more or they need less, right? So I think that's what we're seeing. And I've had a number of patients that were able just to in time get off. Now, I don't prescribe. So what I always do the tests, send them back to their prescribing doctor with some explanation and the labs and say, hey, I think we should try to reduce their dose. And I'm not saying just ignore it, but reduce the dose. Let's measure them in 30 days, see where they're at. And if they're doing great, let's just keep going with what we're doing. And initially I had a lot of kind of pushback from a bunch of physicians.
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't anymore. So I have less and less. So usually what happens is that after a couple sending back, the physicians are usually pretty good. Like, yep, they'll reduce the dose, because the proof oftentimes in the pudding. Not everybody's easy, right? And
yes,
so
some get their egos in a way, the doctors, and yeah.
and even from a patient perspective, some patients are easier to help get to where they need to get, and some people are it's a more complicated case. But I think for a large percentage of the people that I work with, 6 months is a good time frame to see positive change. And that's usually my kind of starting point with somebody. If we're starting new, I'm like, look, you got to think about this you got to give this a good 6-month process. And the vast majority of my patients see moderate to significant improvement in signs and symptoms, and typically improvement in their labs in a 6-month time frame. So I think that gives people hope. There are a few people that, man, we're just we're plugging along really a little bit slower, just because of they're super sensitive to foods. They've had leaky gut for so long. They can't, everything's sent. They're sensitive to everything. They have terrible gut issues, or, small changes create big challenges for them. So some people are slower, but I definitely, people can get better. And that's the thing I want people to understand. It's the reason I wrote the book. You can recover. I had Hashimoto's. I was insulin resistant. I don't have it I don't have it, or it's in remission, or whatever you want to call it. But when you identified the stressors that drove my cell stress and cell danger response,
and so do you give some practical like usable information in the new book that's coming out? I want to hear about that too.
Yeah. So the book's broken down into 3 parts. The first part is written by my friend and colleague, Dr. Kelly Haldeman, who was an MD, who became an ND and practiced functional medicine because she had Hashimoto's. She was diagnosed with MS and essentially was told, hey, you got to, as a medical physician, this is it. You got MS, go home, get your affairs in order, and see ya. And she found functional medicine, and it kind of turned her health around. So she writes the first part from the perspective of a medical doctor. Hey, this is what we do, and this is why it is the way it is. This is what we do. This is what our guidelines tell us. So this is what it is. And then here's why there's potentially some problems, right? So she's kind of given the insight of the medical physician. The second part of the book is I wrote to talk about the problems with the current model and dig into the science. It's heavily cited about cellular physiology, the cell danger response, what I call the hypothyroid spectrum. I talk about multi-system adaptive disorder, which is when all these other systems start to become compromised, and we think I got a gut problem, I got an adrenal problem, I got a thyroid problem, I got this, and I got 12 different problems going on. Nope, you got one big problem. You got excessive cell stress. That's what we got to focus on. If we focus on that, all this web of dysfunction starts to get better, right? Instead of trying to pick around the edges. So it's a heavy section in there, lots of analogies, but heavy stuff, and really heavily cited. And then the third part is all on solutions, right? And I talk about Kelly and I talk about fitness factors in the book and how to get yourself healthy. You have to improve your health and fitness in different categories: your physical fitness, your dietary fitness, your metabolic fitness, your emotional fitness, your sleep fitness, your respiratory fitness. So you've got to improve. If you improve these key aspects that make up your health and wellness, you don't have to worry. You spend less time worrying about the problems and more time just worrying on, how do I make myself physically healthier? How do I improve my diet? How do I improve my fitness level in these categories? That's where we should put our time. How do I improve those? And when you improve those things, the overall health improves. So we give lots of tips to do those things. What people won't find is, what's the supplement solution to fix this? And a lot of books, and no offense to anybody else, but a lot of times what people do is they'll write a book and say, hey, if you take this supplement, it'll do this. If you take acetylcholine, it'll do that. If you take glutathione, it'll do that. And that's great. I didn't want that book, because I know what happens when people read that book. They go out and buy those supplements and add those to their already list of supplements they're taking. And then they show up in my office with 30 supplements in 30 different products that they take every day. And maybe you're taking 60, 70 capsules per day, and then want to know what are they missing, right?
Yeah.
If you need 20 supplements a day to be this sick, you don't need any. So usually one of the first things I have to do, and maybe you do too, is get them off their supplements, right?
Yeah.
So the third section of the book is all about what you can do on your own to improve those levels of fitness. And we do have a discussion in there on health, because I don't think we have a really good discussion about what is health. Everybody's got different opinions on it, but we don't have a great definition. And so in there, I want people to read that and start to consider what does that mean? Healthy, right? And it's more of a spectrum than it is a thing. But I'm sure you see it. You see the person who's overweight on blood pressure medication, a statin, said, my doctor says I'm healthy.
Yeah.
Okay. And so based on what? Well, my cholesterol is normal. But you're taking a statin. Yep. So I don't know if that's healthy. Well, he says I'm healthy. Okay, so are you as healthy as the guy or this gal here who doesn't need any of those things? I guess so. Right. So what is health? I'm physically fit, but can I climb Everest tomorrow? Maybe not. Does that make me, what is health? I mean, I think that's a discussion. So we talk about that in the book, and I'll say that as a teaser for people to look at, because I think that's one of the big things we have to solve if we're going to redefine and figure out how to help people, is we got to have a better definition. Because if there's no really good definition of health, everybody assumes they're healthy and we have no standard. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
what is it? What does it mean?
Yeah.
And typically what we see is health is the absence of illness or absence of disease, or it's physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means I'm healthy. Okay, well, what's healthy mean? A state of wellness. Okay, well, what's wellness? Well, it's when you're healthy. Okay, so what does that mean? You know what I mean? So we don't have a good definition. And I think we have to figure that out. And then we have to figure out once we know we have a good definition,
then we can
start
strive
to
toward it.
Yeah. And so we don't, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so where can people find you?
So my website is rejuvegencenter.com. That's the best place if you're trying to get some information from me, that's a good place to go. I'm not a great social media guy, but I did.
Yes, you are.
Well, I've gotten better.
Oh my gosh, you're a million times better than I am.
Well, I don't know about that.
I like your Instagram channel.
So I found, somebody convinced me about 2 years ago to start doing something on Instagram, and I felt super uncomfortable. But I think I've found my groove on Instagram, just putting posts out. So I put a lot of posts on Instagram.
Eric, you're one of the only Instagram channels I actually actively go in and watch. So that's a huge compliment.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So I have that. I go in there and I do a lot of explaining, like we did on this podcast.
Yeah.
Like occasionally I get people's like, yeah, but how do I fix it? And that usually means that they didn't listen to what I'm trying. It's about education. There's not a fix.
No, there's no protocol.
There's no protocol.
One set protocol.
It's about principles. Like everybody develops a condition for different reasons. And that's what we want you to understand. And then I have a podcast, Thyroid Answers Podcast, which you are going to be on a future episode. So we had a good conversation about estrogen and estrogen dominance and the relationship with physiology. So that'll be good. But that's really where I'm at. So Instagram, my website, the podcast, and now you can go out. By the time this probably releases, the Thyroid Debacle will be available
on Amazon.
Amazon.
What's the date it's coming out?
It'll be out the week of June 14th.
Oh, wow. So fast. Okay.
So it is, it's been a long process.
It's like next week.
So it'll be next week.
I'm not sure when you're recording.
Next week from this recording. So it should be out by then. I'll be super excited once it's in my hand.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I can't wait. I'm going to get it for sure. Because it sounds like it could be for the lay person, but also for a clinician or like somebody needs to step up from the basics.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, I think it'll be a book like Datis Kharrazian's book was, because that was when he came out with that book, he wrote it for the lay person. But it was really, I think tons of functional medicine practitioners picked it up because they didn't understand. He gave a whole new insight into thyroid physiology that we didn't learn. This is going to be another insight into it. So I think physicians, it's a good book for physicians. I think it's a good book for the lay person. And I think it's a really good book because of that third section for anybody for health. Because at the end of the day, I think you'd probably agree with me. If you're going to get healthy and stay healthier, you're going to have to put work into it. It's super easy to be unhealthy and ill. It's so easy.
Yeah.
You don't even have to try and you can be unhealthy and ill, right? But it takes a ton of work to maintain your muscle mass, to be healthy, to be fit, to have, just to do things right. So it's a lot of work, but it's doable. And the foundational things, it doesn't matter what healthcare problem. You got cardiovascular issues, you got to exercise right, you got to eat right, you got to sleep well, you got to breathe well.
Yeah.
If you got diabetes, you got to eat well, you got to sleep well, you got to exercise well, you got to have a healthy gut. If you got thyroid issues, you got to eat well, you got to sleep well, you got to exercise well, you got to have, it's all the same stuff. So all the things that you and I talk to our clients about,
yeah,
the foundational principles are the same.
Yeah, 100%. Right? Yeah, that's what I talk about all day long.
It does.
They have to be there. You can't make a workaround. I mean, we all want the quick fix, and there is no quick fix. You have to do these foundational pieces.
Listen, I want a quick fix too. Yeah. It's just not realistic. I mean, anytime you get a quick fix, you better be ready for the rebound that's coming, because it's coming. So I think there's some wise person once said that people who have, something like people who have whose life is easy have a hard life, and people whose day-to-day activities are hard have a really easy life. And somehow nice. Like that, I forget how it goes, but essentially when you're putting in a lot of work, whether it's your physical job, your family, your health, things are probably pretty good for you, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not putting in much work on a daily basis to maintain your health, to maintain your family, to maintain your relationship, it's probably not very good. No. Right? Because it's too easy. So the same thing with their health. If you're not putting much time and energy into managing your health and well-being, you're probably not going to have good health. It takes work. And I think it's, when people look at you and they say, Karen, you're beautiful, you're fit. Oh, it's so easy for you. Right?
Yeah.
Like,
no.
Yeah. When I hear, people like, well, I had this, you don't know what's happened in my life. I'm like, listen, you want my backstory?
Yeah.
Like, do you want my backstory? Because we can all make excuses, right? And every time, somebody, woe is me, and this, listen, I get it. It sucks. Yeah. But somebody else has got a worse story than you. Yeah. And somebody has a worse story than you, and they're overcoming it. Yeah. So
yeah.
Pull up your bootstraps.
Eric, I just did a whole podcast on that. I almost called it Kill the Little Bitch Inside, but I decided that I would call it like tough love, weight loss and health advice or something. And then inside the podcast, I was like, you got to kill that little bitch inside that is whining about how hard it is to get healthy and lose weight and get better. I'm like, pull up your socks and just do it. You have to do the work. And there's no easy way out of this. You got to put some effort into it. So anyways, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I can't wait to have you back for another time, because I know I'm going to have probably a flood of questions coming in. I have a lot of thyroid patients listening to this. So now they're going to be sent your way, which is great, because you guys have got an amazing podcast. And like I said, Instagram channel with a ton of information on it. So you deliver the information in a way that people, I think, can understand it, because it's quite technical and sciencey, and some of that can go over people's head, but I like the way you break it down, and you have nice short videos on your social media so people can take in the information, I think, easier. But
well, I thank you. I appreciate coming on. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to coming back on.
Yeah, great. Well, have a great day, everybody. And don't forget to leave a written review, 5 stars, of course.
Absolutely.
Don't bother for both me and Eric. All right, guys, have a great day wherever you are in the world.